Welcome to Philosophy 2200, Ancient Philosophy. Today we're going to be looking at passages from Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and in particular we'll try to focus on Chapter 9, but not before looking at some of the opening chapters in Book 2. I want to start on page 22 at the very top. This is right around 1103a, 19 or so. None of the virtues of character comes to be present in us by nature, since none of the things that are by nature can be habituated to be otherwise. What he's getting at here is we're not good people, we don't become good people naturally, because as he puts it, things that are by nature none of the things that are by nature can be habituated to be otherwise. In other words, things that are natural cannot be habituated to be otherwise. And so if human goodness was natural, then humans could not be habituated to be vicious and evil, but good God, we know they are often. And so therefore, virtues of character, we shouldn't expect them to become present by nature. Alright, for example, as he puts it, a stone, which by nature falls downward, could not be habituated to fall upward, not even if one were to train it by throwing it upward 10,000 times. I imagine Aristotle had one of his students try this. You can try this for extra credit if you like. Throw a stone up in the air 10,000 times. Let me know if it ever stays up there and starts moving upwards instead of coming back to earth. Nor could fire be habituated to, and look, granted, Aristotle's understanding of physics is certainly not complete here. Nor could fire be habituated to move downward, nor could any of the things that happen by nature in one way be habituated to happen in another way. Of course they can. This is what we call technology. This is honestly what science means, Aristotle. We habituate nature to act in ways that it doesn't want to act for our own purposes. But okay, just understanding Aristotle's claim here, what he's really getting at is, boy, there's a lot of vicious human beings out there. A lot of ignorant, angry, mean-spirited, vicious, ugly people. And they're not that way by nature. They've been made that way. And if that's true, we shouldn't expect to be good by nature either. Something along those lines, okay? Alright, let's move forward a little bit. We do take on the virtues. How do we take on these virtues? By first being at work in them, just as also in other things, namely the arts. How do you learn to paint? Not by taking, 10 years of classes on the history and theory of painting, but by painting. And painting, and hopefully eventually learning about history and theory too, sure. But you want to be a painter, you got to start painting, right? Whether or not you can actually do it well at first, of course you can't do it well first, or it's almost certain that you won't do it well at first. But you got to do it. We take on the virtues by first being at work in them, just like we do in the arts. The things that one who has learned them needs to do, we learn by doing. And people become, say, house builders by building houses, right? When I used to work on construction sites, right? They certainly didn't say, well, before you can come out here and be a laborer on this construction site, you need to go to the university and earn a bachelor's degree in construction site laboring. No. You want to come and be a laborer here? Pick up those cinder blocks and carry them over to that place, etc. You just start doing it. People are going to tell you what to do. You start doing it, and then before you know it, you are now a house builder building a house, or a harpist. You got to play the harp. So too, as he puts it, we become just by doing things that are just, temperate by doing things that are temperate, and courageous by doing things that are courageous. So this is, one clue to what he's talking about with virtue and happiness, right? You have to, it's an activity you must do, and you must, for that activity to qualify as virtue and to be excellent. In the words of Allen Iverson, it's going to take a lot of practice. Okay? Practice. On the top of page 23 then, he's going to go on to point out, right? By acting in our dealings with people, some of us become just, others unjust, right? Are you cheating people? You're becoming unjust, right? Are you being honest and giving somebody back their change even when they didn't even realize they were owed it, right? If you're doing those kinds of things, you are becoming just by acting in your dealings with other people in just or unjust ways. Right? By acting in frightening situations and getting habituated to be afraid or to be confident. So if we want to be courageous, for instance, for Aristotle, you're going to have to put yourself in a frightening situation on purpose and habituate yourself to be confident. And to be confident because you should be confident, because you're actually learning how to navigate these kinds of dangerous situations without losing your presence of mind, your focus. It is similar with the things that are involved with desires, with angry impulses. For some people become temperate and gentle, while others become spoiled and irritable. The ones from turning themselves this way in these situations, the others from turning themselves that way. So in other words, right, we can even, it's, in a sense he's saying we choose our sort of dispositions, our emotional states, by how we habituate ourselves to deal with these emotions, and how we focus our attention on our feelings and why we're feeling the way we feel. In a word, then, he says, active states come into being from being at work in similar ways. In other words, the active state that's going to be happiness, right? That's going to be this ability to sort of manifest happiness. Requires a lot of work, of practice. That's all he's getting at there. Now, let's move down to the bottom of page 23. This is crucial. This is Aristotle's definition of virtue. We've already received his definition of happiness. Happiness is to make the virtues active in our souls, okay, and to manifest what he calls logos, reason, or articulate speech. Well, now we're going to actually, and so if happiness requires us to manifest or realize our rational potential in virtuous ways, it would help to know what he means by virtue. So as he puts it here on the bottom, page 23, first then, one must recognize this: things such as virtues are of such a nature as to be destroyed by deficiency and by excess, as we see. Since one must use visible examples as evidence for invisible things, since virtues are psychic, soul phenomena, we need visible examples in the case of strength and health. So now we're going to try to use examples drawn from cases of strength and health, but we're going to use them as though we're talking about the virtues of the soul. But he says, as with strength or health, right? Excessive gymnastic exercises destroy your health just as much as deficient ones, right? If you never go to the gym and never exercise, that's excessively, whatever the word is there, excessively weak, excessively lazy, excessively flabby, or whatever. And that can destroy your health, right? Never exercising, bad for your health, right? But he's also pointing out going to the gym sort of too much and over exerting yourself is also bad for your health and can also destroy your health. And so in other words, you know, the right thing to do here is to sort of find a middle ground between these extremes. Drink and food, when they come to be too much or too little, destroy one's health, right? You can starve to death because you didn't have enough food to eat. You can also die from health complications resulting from habitual overeating. And with drink, alcohol, it would be the same thing, for instance, with alcohol. Actually, it's not the same thing with alcohol. Let's just use water then. It is very similar with water. You can not have enough water and become dehydrated, and that can be potentially fatal. You can actually also die from drinking too much water. I remember this because in the military we had to do such grueling work that we would often sweat through our own clothing, and we were constantly told to drink water, and yet people were a little bit concerned at times that if we weren't careful, you had to also understand that you couldn't just drink too much water. In other words, there is the possibility of ingesting too much water and dying from that as well. So with drinking water, right, you want to find a middle ground between dehydration and drinking so much water that you die or make yourself ill. All right. So he says it's the same way with temperance and courage and the other virtues. This is around line 20 of 1104a on page 24. Someone who runs away from and fears everything, right? A little rustling in the bushes, firecracker goes off, somebody, hits the ground and is cowering or in a fetal position. That's a coward, right? Somebody who runs away from and fears everything and never stands their ground in the presence of any danger. That's a coward. While someone who fears nothing at all but goes out to confront everything is rash, which is not the same thing as courageous. And so The idea is courage will be something in between those extremes. Similarly, someone who indulges in every pleasure and refrains from none becomes spoiled, while someone who shuns all pleasures, like a boorish bumpkin, becomes in a certain way insensible. That's Aristotle's verdict, I suppose, on the person who won't even have a single drink at the dinner party, huh? So temperance and courage are destroyed by excess and by deficiency, but are preserved by an intermediate condition, and that intermediate condition is virtue. Okay, and now he's going to end then chapter 2 here by noting that virtues require habituation and practice. Practice literally makes perfect. If you're wondering where that cliche comes from, it could be taken from Aristotle. Okay. So, I want to move forward a bit. Let's move into chapter 4, right around 1105b, where Aristotle notes that in having virtues, when we talk about being virtuous, knowing is of little or no strength, while the other conditions have not a little, but all the power. And they are the ones which arise from repeatedly performing just or temperate actions. In other words, what he's getting at here, and this is honestly where the Greek notion of akrasia begins to manifest itself, and this is one of Aristotle's advances over Plato's intellectualist position on virtue. What he's getting at here is, it's not that knowing is irrelevant, it's just that, if you learn, for instance, the definition of happiness from this book, and if you learn Aristotle's definition of virtue, what he's getting at here is that's not gonna be that much help for you, right? Unless, the thing that matters for Aristotle is not knowing what the true definition of happiness or virtue is. What matters is repeatedly performing virtuous actions. That's what matters. And so, in other words, right, people who have wonderful learning about virtues are not necessarily going to be virtuous if they're not practicing what they preach, you might say. Thus, while the actions are called just or temperate, whenever they are the sorts of things that a just or temperate person would do, this is the top of page 27 now, right around 1105b10 or so. So while actions they are called just or temperate whenever they are the sorts of things that a just or temperate person would do. The one who does them is not just or temperate unless he also does them in a way that just and temperate people do them. Right? So in other words, it's not enough to do the right thing. You better do it with the right attitude and in the right way. Otherwise, you don't get credit. Right? You don't get credit for being virtuous when you do something you don't want to do. According to Aristotle, now Kant's going to disagree, of course. Kant, later on in the history of philosophy, will say something like, sure, a good will, good intention is important, but at the end of the day, virtue is about doing the right thing regardless of how you feel about it. Well, for Aristotle, no. You better feel the right way about it and do the right thing for it to count. Okay. So, it is well said then. So this means Aristotle likes something that he's saying. It's not always clear that he's in agreement with the positions he's articulating here, but here he is. It is well said then that by performing just actions, one becomes a just person. And by performing temperate actions, one becomes a temperate person. And no one is going to become good by not performing these actions. But most people do not perform them, but believe that by taking refuge in talk, they are philosophizing, and in that way will be people of serious stature, doing something similar. One thing he's getting at, is that, for example, philosophers here are going to talk about virtue, but what he wants is something like a practical element here. He wants, to see people practicing and habituating themselves to doing virtuous things as part of what we would call instruction and education. It's not good enough that you have some teacher who can talk well. It's not good enough that you're a student who can listen well. If, being virtuous is about activity, there must be the doing of the virtuous things. And that's actually central and primary. And that's how you actually become proficient in virtue. There can be a place for talk and for learning, yes, but it's more of a supporting and clarifying kind of role, and the central thing to do here is the actual activity of practicing virtues, that is, of practicing being just and being temperate and being courageous. Okay. Now, where to go next? Chapter 5. It's a fascinating chapter. You can kind of go to the very end. You see what Aristotle's conclusion is here. He begins chapter 5 by saying, let's examine what virtue is. Here are some candidates for answers. Maybe virtue is a feeling. Maybe virtue is a predisposition. Maybe virtue is an active condition. It's going to be one of these, he's going to say. If you look at, again, he's going to rule out two of these three possibilities. He's going to then, by a process of elimination, end up at the answer that virtues are not feelings nor predispositions, but active conditions. That is, we train and practice to do excellent things, and when circumstances allow, we then do those excellent things. Put ourselves into what he calls an active condition. Right now, for example, reading and understanding ancient Greek is an active condition in Professor Turner. But for me to, actually do the activity of reading and understanding ancient Greek, I must be in the presence of an ancient Greek text, right? In other words, I have this potential that has already been worked on, and I've developed it. But it still requires materials, for example. That's different from a predisposition. All of you in this class have the predisposition, you might say, to learn languages such as ancient Greek. You have that capability, but you haven't worked on it yet and developed it. So that's kind of the difference. There's a sense in which virtues could be predispositions, sure, perhaps, but it's not enough to merely have the predisposition. You have to work on that disposition, train it, cultivate it, shape it, direct it, reinforce it, etc. Okay, now he's in chapter 6, he's going to go on to say what kind of active condition this is. So look at the bottom of the first paragraph, the beginning of chapter 6, right around 1106a 22 or 23. The virtue of a human being would be the active condition from which one becomes a good human being. In other words, you have all these virtues: justice, temperance, courage, for example. Active. You have practiced and sharpened and honed these virtues. They're just waiting for the chance, right? Courage, the virtue in you, is just waiting for a situation of danger in which, in which you will run certain risks and dangers to accomplish some good. And then you're just waiting for the opportunities then. And when the opportunities happen, you have done what you need to do to be prepared for those opportunities, those chances, and you now realize this potential you have. So it's an active condition. It's a condition. It needs to be, it needs, something outside of itself to happen, right? For instance, I have the active condition of being able to read Greek, but I need Greek text, right? For instance. It would also help if I had a few people that could also read it with me and help me out a little bit. We can have a conversation about it. These are the things that facilitate that activity really happening. But when you don't have that Greek text and you don't have friends reading it with you, now it just is an active condition. It's something that can be activated at any time, but is currently dormant or something like this. Just like somebody who's trained to be courageous, is not necessarily going to be looking around very tense or something at all times, but has a sort of training that is ready to be activated given certain conditions. Gunshots, explosions, fire, somebody yelling for help, etc. Okay, this is then going to lead us to the point I want to stress in closing here now. So let's look on page 28, middle of chapter 6, then we'll turn to chapter 9, right around line 29 or so of 1106a. By a mean that belongs to the thing. So this mean between extremes is not in us. It kind of belongs to the thing, he says. By the mean that belongs to the thing, I am speaking of what holds a position equally apart from either of the extremes, which is one and the same thing for everyone. But the mean in relation to us is what neither goes too far nor falls short, and this is not one thing nor the same thing for everyone. So in a sense, it is true for everyone that courage is a mean between extremes of cowardice and recklessness. But what would be courageous for you or I to do in a situation is not necessarily the same thing. Okay? Why? Because we're not the same. Because we haven't had the same backgrounds, the same training. Because we might have differences of strength or of whatnot, of physical conditioning, all sorts of things. So I think what he's getting at is, in a formal sense, any virtue is going to be a mean between extremes. But in a concrete sense, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for you? The idea is the substance of what this formal requirement, the substance of what it means to be in between these extremes is going to be different for each one of us. Okay. So let's skip ahead now to chapter 9. And let's see, here we go. One who aims at the mean, you, I, anyone, ought first to pull back from what is more contrary to it. So these are Aristotle's tips for target practice. He's used, a metaphor of an archer aiming at a target, and he says it's easy to miss the target, it's hard to hit it. It takes a lot of practice. He complicates things further by saying, well, happiness isn't even a stationary target, it's moving, and it's different for each person in a sense, based on their own circumstances and conditions. And so it's really difficult to hit this target. But here he wants to give us some advice. So if you're trying to hit this target, aiming at the mean, virtuous activity, you ought first to pull back from what is more contrary to the mean. So in other words, think, right? Which of these, so you're aiming at a target, you might say, but then there are these two other extremes that if you're not very careful, you'll end up hitting the extremes instead of the target. Well, if so, identify which of the extremes is more contrary to the mean, okay, and aim away from it. One of the extremes, one is a greater error. So of the extremes with, for instance, courage, maybe it's that cowardice is a greater error and recklessness isn't. In any case, you have to figure this out, right? Which is more contrary? Try to avoid the greater error, right? So it's not always the case that, virtue is a mean between extremes, yes, but it's not always the case that each extreme is equally bad. So he wants you to analyze that in each case. He wants you to think, right? Which extreme is worse? One way to make sure I don't mess this up is to aim away from the greater error. That way, I have a much better chance of hitting the target, or if I miss the target, of missing it in a way that's less bad. That's all. Now, what's another tip Aristotle offers on page 35, or around 1109b, line 4 or 5? We ought to consider, he says, what we ourselves are carried away toward, since different people are of a nature to incline toward different things. Right? For some people, being reckless is going to be their inclination, whereas for others, being cowardly is. And what he wants to say now is, okay, we have to recognize what our nature is here, and then we need to drag ourselves over toward the opposite side. So if my nature is timorous and fearful, and I naturally tend towards hiding in the face of danger or something like this, what he's saying is, I need to recognize that and sort of counter-train myself, drag myself to the other opposite side. This is almost like an archer who is shooting at a target with like really bad wind conditions or something. And if the wind is blowing a certain way, you might have to like aim away from where you're actually trying to hit or something like this in order to hit the target. There's something like that he's getting at here. So I just want you to think about that, right? For any virtue, there are going to be two corresponding extremes that are called vices, but these two extremes are not equally bad, right? So aim for the less bad one. But then also our nature inclines us towards one or the other extreme. We need to drag ourselves from the one we're inclined towards the other one. Okay? So if I'm inclined to eat too much, I need to drag myself, that is, train myself through habituation to be more moderate even than I might normally want to be, simply because I incline towards gluttony or something. Finally, in everything, he says, one must guard most against the pleasant thing and against pleasure, for we do not judge it without bribes. So, what he's getting at here is, pleasure, the desire for pleasure, can corrupt our judgment. And so we should, when looking at, virtue as a mean between extremes, we should also recognize that pleasure might lead us astray, and we should incline away from pleasure and do the less pleasurable thing. This is actually an inkling of what later for Kant will become something like our rational duty, where Kant wants us to set aside entirely our concern for pleasure and just do what's right. Aristotle's kind of anticipating this in a sense in this moment by saying pleasure can lead us to make the wrong choice here, or can lead us towards an extreme or towards a vice. How about, we train ourselves, practice to not go for the thing that seems more pleasurable, and if we do this, we'll actually be able to hit the mark, the mean between extremes, better. By doing these things, Aristotle writes, we shall be most able to hit the mean. Now, look at the very end then of Book 2 and the very end of Chapter 9 here. Aristotle writes, while the mean active condition, that is virtue, this mean between extremes, this active condition that's ready to be put into action at any moment, provided the circumstances call for it, right? I can't be moderate if I'm not in the presence of food and drink. Okay, I can't show you, I can't demonstrate even for myself that I have this virtue if we're not eating and drinking, or if there's not like sensual pleasure that's a possibility for us to be engaged in, right? So it has to be an active condition in that sense. I'm ready to go and activate it, but conditions also have to facilitate that. While the mean active condition is praised in all things, so virtue is always what we're aiming at, mean between extremes, one ought to incline away from it sometime towards the excess, the less bad one, when the danger of, when the danger of a certain excess is really great and really catastrophic, aim towards the other excess, and you'll have a better chance at least avoiding the very worst outcome. Sometimes we need to aim or incline ourselves toward a deficiency if we have an inclination in the other way. For in that way we shall almost easily hit the mark of the mean and of what is done well, and of course also watch out for the enticing allurements of pleasure, and be sure our judgment and our action isn't being corrupted by an inclination towards what is pleasing and pleasurable for us. So reaching the mean requires at times deviation, discretion, even a bit of misdirection. All right, I've said enough. We are out of time for today. This is all I can do with Book 2 for now, so I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to talking with you all again soon.